Okay, today I'm joined by Tom Rosal. Tom is host of the very popular YouTube channel Survive the Jive. Survive the Jive is a history channel which focuses on the pagan religions of ancient Europe. It also looks at linguistics, genetics, anthropology, and other disciplines in order to gain insights into ancient peoples. Tom, it's an honor to be joined by you today. I'm a huge fan of your show. It's been an inspiration for me, and I've just learned so much from listening to you. So thank you so much for coming on.
No problem at all. I really enjoy your channel as well. I've been watching it over the summer. Lots of interesting essays about metapolitics.
Oh, thank you for that. I appreciate that. I thought we would just begin by maybe you could talk about how you became interested in these topics. Did it start when you were young, or was it something that developed later on in your life?
Which topic specifically?
I think specifically, how did you become interested in paganism, and how did you become interested in Indo-Europeans? What I'm interested in, have you always been drawn to like controversial topics, or when you began studying the Indo-Europeans, was it sort of in just a naive, curious way?
That's an interesting question. I think I don't think I was. I've certainly in my youth been no stranger to controversy because I was, a sort of difficult adolescent, a rebellious adolescent. But I don't. I mean, even before that, in my childhood, I was very interested in biology and evolution, and I like to read all about the evolution of different animals, and I memorized a great many Latin names for different genus and species and things from prehistoric and modern. And as a child, I originally wanted to be a soldier, and then to be a paleontologist or some kind of zoologist to work in biology. So that interest in my interest in genetics sort of rekindles this sort of childhood fascination with biology. But the topic of paganism and religion, not such a major thing. I was a Catholic as a growing up, and I rejected that in my adolescence, and tried very hard to become an atheist. But it was an enormous effort of my will to try and shed a religious worldview, because I always have perceive the world from the perspective of a religious man, and it's very difficult to see this atheist perspective. Actually, for me, I mean, some people are completely immersed in it, but it was very hard. But I convinced myself of it, maybe half convinced myself of it for a while. But then I realized I definitely didn't believe in atheism. I just knew something else was true, but I definitely didn't believe in the Bible. I just don't believe that to be a true book. So that in that sense, you could have said in a broader and more informal definition of pagan, I was a pagan at that stage. Although to be specifically someone who was interested in and studying the ancient religions of pre-Christian or pre-Islamic world, I as a child I was read many folkloric and mythological tales. Greek mythology fascinated me from about the age of 9. I got very into that, and but I had a book on Chinese and Russian mythology as well. But it wasn't until about the age of 24 that I seriously started studying paganism as a topic. Around 23, I started reading it a lot, and then 24, I started to describe myself as a pagan, and that was a turning point, because I was trying to sort of give a name and a form to religious feelings I'd had for a long time. And actually, I've said this before in other interviews, I often get asked this question about when I became pagan, but I did say Nietzsche was important for me, reading that at the age of about 22, reading Beyond Good and Evil, because it helped me shed some of the moral detritus that I'd sort of kept on from my Catholic upbringing. And that also, I was quite inspired by Nietzsche's presentation of the Dionysian ideal. Although I reject a lot of Nietzschean philosophy since then, but it was certainly life-changing at the time. And after graduating with my first degree, I read Nietzsche and became quite Nietzschean in my outlook in all respects. But then that led to a pursuit of paganism in general. And then from about 24, I started specifically looking at what is the paganism of the English and how does that pertain to the English Dasein, the English worldview, our specific way of being in the world. And of course, anyone who becomes interested in ancient Germanic paganism or ancient Germanic people, usually by extension, must take an interest in the Indo-Europeans, because it is through comparative mythology that you can understand, better understand the Germanic mythology, looking at it in comparison to Greek and Indian and other types of paganism, and the social structures of those societies as well have parallels in Celtic and Germanic, etc. So this is quite common within the field of Germanic philology and comparative mythology. You will become aware of Indo-Europeans and the study of Indo-Europeans. And I certainly didn't become interested in Indo-Europeans as a topic because of any associated controversy.
I'm thinking about Camille Paglia and how she was raised as like a Catholic, like yourself, but she noticed in Catholicism some residues of paganism, and she was drawn to those rather than the faith. Did you have anything parallel to that? Did you notice any pagan residues in Catholicism as a child, or not really?
Well, yes and no. I mean, when in a Catholic school when I was 9, I remember when we started talking about Greek myths, the teacher said, "I think we found your calling," because I suddenly took an interest. But my interest in the myths was not the same as an actual pagan would have taken, because I was absolutely fascinated by the monsters. It was the enemies of the heroes and the gods, rather than the heroes and the gods themselves, that interested me. So I just loved the idea of the chimera or the hydra, these kind of creatures. And of course, children are fascinated by monsters, whether that be the modern monsters of like dinosaurs that we give to them, or ancient ones like dragons. This is just a part of the psychology of a child. Yeah, the question, did I perceive paganism within Catholicism? I don't know if I would have been that analytical of what Christianity was. I found it quite boring a lot of the time. I remember having instinctive rejections of certain things. When I was cast to play Joseph in the Nativity play, it was controversy because I started to refuse to, because I thought the character was weak because of the way he didn't reject his wife after she was pregnated by another person, even if it was a god. And we negotiated, and I had to perform as Joseph at the convent for the nuns, but I didn't have to perform it in front of the parents for the second performance. But another thing, I refused to sing the sort of modern age, like wishy-washy sort of hymn that they sing in praise of the donkey that carried Mary. I said I wouldn't, because I considered that I didn't consider a donkey to be worthy of worship. So, and of course, the donkey is seen as an unclean beast in many ancient religions. It's not a noble animal. You wouldn't see a pagan worshipping a donkey. But I found the donkey. I mean, if it had been a lion, I wouldn't have had a problem. It would have been a noble beast like an eagle or a lion. But I just didn't like that. Now, you could call that an instinctive paganism, but it's not exactly what paganism is. It's just a sort of a rejection of some aspects of Christianity with a very crude understanding of theology. Even I don't even pretend that I understood Catholicism, just because I was raised Catholic. I only was a child, so I couldn't possibly have a thorough understanding of it. But I didn't really like the character of Jesus. I was devoutly Christian in the sense that I believed in the Bible, but mostly, but I just couldn't believe in the Jesus part. I was more, my faith was mostly manifested as a child in a fear of the devil and an attempt to appease the God the Father in prayer. So I was really just focusing more on the devil and God rather than Jesus, who I didn't really didn't appeal to me at all, actually, that character. So yeah, in that sense, I wasn't a good Catholic. But yeah, it's only as an adult when I can really look at how much of the rite of Mass and the architecture of the Catholic churches are obviously taken from Roman pagan rites and temples.
Mm. Well, that naturally leads us to one of the things that I really want to talk to you about, which is European man's perception of himself in like this day and age. It seems that I'm sure you'll agree with me when I say that European man is confused about who he is. Some will say that he is fundamentally like a Judeo-Christian, but I think that you would have a very different answer.
Well, yes, I mean, the term Judeo-Christian is modern, of course. People didn't use that term in the height of European Christianity in the Middle Ages. They just considered themselves Christian. But the Christian faith has been such a huge part of Europe that it can't be disregarded so easily as some would like. That the most lasting influence of it is the moral framework. But it's quite clear in the early stages of Christianity that it hadn't actually penetrated into the moral structure of European man to the extent it did, in my opinion, after the Renaissance, with the rise of Protestantism, especially, where you get a real sort of a new Christian morality, which doesn't exist in medieval Catholic time, the Middle Ages, and I think in a way the modern atheistic secular West is more of a realization of that moral framework than the Catholic Middle Ages were, because I think a lot of the time what you see in especially the early Christian Europe is a continuation of precisely the same social structures and behaviors, state actions of like militant imperialism, subjugation of rival people, of neighboring peoples. This kind of, you have sacred kings. All of these things are continuations of the culture of Europe that existed prior to the adoption of Christianity. So now then after Christianity, they are justified and rationalized according to a new theology and a new moral framework, but the actual behaviors remain the same. And I think a lot of the Crusaders, the motivation in the average Crusader was not meaningfully distinct from that of earlier Indo-European raiders. They were, going into battle to kill enemies and steal what they could while they were there. And at the same time, they also prayed for the assistance of the god that they worshipped. But now that Christian moral framework did change Europe and has changed it. And I think that's what now governs the world. It is the final development of the Christian moral worldview, although now admittedly in a non-Christian form, in fact in a non-religious form.
So it's like, so you very much agree with Nietzsche and the idea that maybe liberalism is sort of like a secularized Christianity.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I think perhaps what we might now talk about is an alternative vision of Europe, one that predates Christianity. We'll talk about paganism and Indo-European people. So obviously, this word Indo-European, in my mind, it's a synonym with Aryan. And the first time I came across that word would have been in high school when I was learning about Nazi Germany. And I was told that this was, in my mind, Aryan was synonymous with German. And it was basically taught to me that that this was a silly idea that was just believed by a handful of people who had been defeated in World War II. But I've come to learn since then, after going to Nepal and speaking to the people there about the caste system, I learned that it perhaps wasn't that simple. Could you just speak to me about the theory of the Indo-European people? When did it first emerge? And where did these people come from?
Okay, those are two big questions. So the term Indo-European did at one point become synonymous with the term Aryan, but I should clarify that that was never 100% agreed on by all scholars, and now it is definitely not really. It doesn't work to call that, because I use the term Aryan still to refer to a specific branch of late Bronze Age Indo-Europeans who were living in Northeast Europe and spread from Northeast Europe into Central Asia, and then from there down into India and Iran. But the original Proto-Indo-Europeans live over 1,000 years before the Aryans, and South Russia and Ukraine mainly, and parts of North Russia as well. But there's no evidence that they would have called themselves Aryan, so it's not really appropriate. It's possible that they had a word from which Aryan derives, which was used as an ethnonym, which would have been Arios or something like that, but that's contested, so it's not certain. So, and it's also useful to distinguish the Aryans from the Indo-Europeans because they lived at quite different times and they were culturally very different. But who are the Proto-Indo-Europeans? Who are the Indo-Europeans? Well, they were first discovered by an Englishman, or Welshman to be precise, Sir William Jones, in the 18th century. He was a philologist. He was working for the Supreme Court in Bengal in the British Raj. And he spoke Welsh and English. And of course, like many educated British people, he spoke Latin and Greek. And as a legal worker in India, he learned some of the Indian languages. He also spoke Persian and Arabic and Hebrew. Now, Persian is an Indo-European language, we know now. Arabic and Hebrew are not, they're Semitic. What he realized is, and no one had ever noticed this at any point in history previously, is that Greek, Latin, Persian, English, Welsh, all are related. And he suggested that they came from a common source. And he's right. No linguist will contest that. It's not really possible to contest it. Of course, prior to that, because of the influence of Christianity and this Middle Eastern centric worldview, everything had always presumed to have been emanated from the Middle East. And there should always have been a view that Hebrew must be like a primordial language of God, and therefore all languages must somehow derive from Hebrew. But although he can tell Arabic was related to Hebrew, these other languages certainly weren't, but they were derived, they were related to each other. And even at that stage, he starts to recognize also that we're not just going to be talking about the language. He also said that in 1786, around then, he said that this must be something to do with culture as well. His exact quote: "When features of resemblance too strong to have been accidental are observable in different systems of polytheism without fancy or prejudice to color them and improve their likeness, we can scarce help believing that some connection has immemorial subsisted between the several nations who have adopted them." So he was not only recognizing Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit derived from a common language, which we now later started to call Proto-Indo-European, but recognized that they must have their mythological correspondences are also there, that religions must have come from a common religion, and that meant there must have been an original race from which all these people derived. Now, that idea of the race was less popular, especially in the 20th century, not just after the Second World War, when it was completely, the entire thing was discredited of a race and of a religion, but the language has never been discredited. But they started to talk about it in terms of just a language and not a race. But even before the war, a lot of people were saying it can't be attributed to a people. The language could be spoken by many peoples or related peoples or something like that. But from the off, William Jones hit the nail on the head, but it took a long while for everyone to come back there. From there, it wasn't like overnight everyone suddenly believed in Indo-Europeans. There was a lot of argument about it, and where the Indo-Europeans came from and whether they existed was debated. By 1826, a German named Heinrich Schultz first suggested maybe Europe, because formerly everyone, still with this kind of Eastern-centric bias, assumed that this primordial people, this primordial language must have been located in Asia, the Heimat. But until this German in 1826 suggested maybe Europe. And then later an Englishman, Robert Latham, also argued specifically and correctly for a southern Russian origin, and that was in 1851. And I think he was, if not the first, one of the first people to correctly identify the Heimat in southern Russia. Although that was not popular at the time, a lot of people wanted to say it was in India or the Himalayas, in Nepal, in Turkey. Lots of places were suggested. After the war, the Russian steppe hypothesis was revived. It hadn't been very big in the 19th century because South Russia is not an interesting place historically. There's not much coming from there. So people wanted to attach it to the great, civilization regions like the Middle East or Asia. But the revival, the Nazis were not responsible for this revival at all. Even some of the Nazis, like Hermann Guntert, argued for an Asian origin. But actually, there was one guy who called it, a German said it was a specifically English eccentricity to imagine that the Indo-Europeans could possibly have originated in Europe, but because it was just seen as just couldn't be possibly true. But then this Lithuanian feminist woman, Maria Gimbutas, after the war, she started saying, somewhere on the Russian steppe, South Russia is the origin, and she's often credited with being the originator of this theory, but she certainly wasn't. It was much earlier. But she attached it to this still popular narrative, which is perhaps living on in people like Bronze Age Pervert, who sort of adopts it, but it's in a different way, but not uncritically, to be fair to him. But the idea that the old Neolithic Europeans were matriarchal and peaceniks and hippie lovers, and then these warlike patriarchal Eastern Europeans came in and changed everything. And
I listened to a lecture. Sorry, Tom. I was going to say, I listened to a lecture with Maria Gimbutas, and she makes the point that maybe prior to the Aryan invasion, in the Indo-European invasion, people are buried in tombs. We find lots of idols that are female rather than male. I think at this time, the female idols outnumber the male ones. And she seemed to think that like the word tomb was etymologically linked to the word womb, and that it was like everyone was going back into the womb. Is there any truth to this idea or no?
No, it's not. Basically, now we've got really good data on the old Europeans as well. I mean, she was half right in the sense that the Indo-European invaders were very brutal, very warlike, very patriarchal, and they did brutally replace the cultures of Northern Europe particularly, and they also brutally replaced the cultures in Southern Europe. But in Southern Europe, the average Southern European is still majority Neolithic European, whereas in Northern Europe, people are about half and half. But in both places, the languages were completely replaced. The only pre-Indo-European languages left in Europe, the only one is Basque. Etruscan held on for a while as well in Tuscany, but that's gone now. So the only one is Basque. All the other languages, except for the Finno-Ugric languages, which came later, all the indigenous languages of Europe wiped out, and the paternal lineages were mostly wiped out as well, with Indo-European ones. But that part's true. So she was vindicated in that respect, and she was vindicated in the respect that she correctly identified the homeland as being in South Russia, Ukraine, that kind of area. But she was completely wrong in the idea that there was any matriarchy in the old religions. What we know now is they were not peaceful. We found massacres everywhere across Europe, like from England to Slovakia and Germany, when Neolithic people were massacring each other and like making huge mass graves, chucking bodies in there, cutting off their heads, killing women and children. These were brutal people. Even examples of cannibalism in the TBK culture in some examples. So that they were not peaceful. They were definitely patriarchal because we can see in the tombs that these are families of ruling elites. So it was thought they were communal graves of like everyone gets to go in them, but now we can see that they're not. Specifically, when we looked at in Britain and Ireland, they're extremely inbred in some cases in Ireland, like very inbred. So they were kind of like Egyptian pharaohs in the sense that they were, keeping their blood pure, and they were patrilineal descended. So that meant that the bloodline was preserved from the male side, not the female side. So patrilineality is very much associated with patriarchy. Male god kings very much associated with patriarchy. It does seem that these were patriarchal cultures, and they may have had goddesses, but so did the Indo-Europeans. That doesn't mean, I mean, if you went to Mexico and see that they have more statues of the Virgin Mary than Jesus, would you then conclude that they were a matriarchal culture? It would be silly to make that conclusion. So, but Gimbutas had a major opponent at that time still after the war, which was Lord Colin Renfrew, who argued for the Anatolian hypothesis. And at that stage, it was still believed that they could have come from Anatolia. But then since 2015, we've had a revolution in genomics, which has proven conclusively that while the Neolithic Europeans who preceded the Indo-Europeans did indeed come primarily from Anatolia, and we do have Anatolian descent from there. And Colin Renfrew was right that European agriculture does derive from Anatolian agriculture. He was wrong to assume that the spread of that Anatolian culture was associated with the spread of Indo-European languages, because they detected a second major spread of DNA after the Anatolian spread, which was from South Russia and Ukraine. And that is the Indo-European spread. So Gimbutas got that right. And Colin Renfrew admitted that he was wrong on that, in that respect. But recently, there's now another controversy this year, because although since 2015, we've now proven that the spread of Indo-European languages and religions was accompanied by the spread of this genetic signal of South Russia, Ukraine area from the steppes. The Harvard team led by David Reich has tried now to, as well as Joseph Lazaridis, a Greek geneticist, he has, the two of them are trying to push the idea that although the Indo-European languages were indeed spread almost entirely by these steppe people, they themselves adopted it, they claim, from a Middle Eastern migration from south of the Caucasus over the Caucasus. But they don't claim to have found this population, and they haven't got any evidence to prove it. So they're mostly arguing from a position of the absence of evidence for one Indo-European speaking group in Anatolia called the Hittites, and they haven't found much steppe signal in there. But other amateur geneticists are pointing out that you can find a steppe signal in Anatolian ancient samples. So it's certainly not universally accepted. And I personally think it's not true. I think that the Indo-European homeland is in the exact epicenter of its dispersal, which is not surprising. And that this other idea of pushing it back to another pre-Indo-European language called Indo-Anatolian, I think that is reaching too far.
Okay, so one of the things I remember from the Gimbutas lecture was she said within Europeans, there is these two tendencies. There's the pre-Indo-European tendency and then the Indo-European tendency. And that would make sense genetically, I guess, where you said before that there's this Neolithic and post-invasion sort of European, the European is a mix of both groups. I'm also reminded of a passage from Nietzsche, which you might remember from Genealogy of Morals, where he seems to talk about he talks about this exact topic. He says, the same holds good for virtually the whole of Europe. To all intents and purposes, the subject race, so he's speaking obviously here about the pre-Indo-European people, has ended up by regaining the upper hand in skin color, shortness of forehead, and perhaps even in intellectual and social instincts. Who can give any guarantee that modern democracy and even modern anarchism, and indeed that predilection for the commune, the most primitive form of social structure, which is common to all of Europe's socialists, are not in essence a huge throwback and that the conquering master race, that of the Aryans, is not physiologically being defeated as well. So I think that that passage right there is Bap's inspiration for the idea of the Longhouse. And it's also related to what Gimbutas was saying, these two tendencies within European people, one maybe towards individualism, the other towards the commune. Do you think there's any truth to this idea, or do you think that this is a sort of silly theory based on outdated notions of pre-Indo-European or pre-Aryan Europe?
A bit of both. I did review Bronze Age Pervert's book in 2019, and in that book, in that review, I praised some aspects of the book, but I also criticized it. And one of the things I criticized was this idea about what he thought about the Longhouse. The Longhouse is not a good symbol of the things he's talking about. I mean, Longhouse, not all Neolithic cultures were the same. There's different cultures around Europe. The TBK or the TBK culture, linear pottery culture, did have longhouses, communal living. That could be what he was referring to. I think Cucuteni Tropilea culture in Romania also had some kind of large communal dwellings, not necessarily longhouses, but in his purpose, it means the same thing. And there was, a difference between the kind of settlements of, Indo-Europeans on the steppe, we don't even have any dwellings for them, so we presume they lived in tents. But Indo-European cultures, when they become more sedentary in Bronze Age Europe, do tend to have like villages and individual homes for families and things like that would now associate with. So there is a difference in dwelling style, but then again, the longhouse continues as in the Nordic culture. The longhouse has a completely different meaning. The longhouse is the most prestigious building in the community, and it's only for the king and his best men, and the whole culture is built around trying to win the king's favor, so you get a seat closer to him at the table in the longhouse. So it's really the Manabund culture is in the longhouse, the mead hall. So longhouse is a little bit of a problem, but the idea that we are this divided between these two natures has been interesting to me philosophically. Dugin tried to say something similar as well, I've heard in some of his lectures, where the idea of we've got this Earth Mother Kubili thing. And I've talked about that in my video on the Earth Mother in Anatolia, Bakhofin's ideas of that. I think it is a bit reaching because we know that the Neolithic culture wasn't matriarchal. And I think that these two natures could be an accurate way of describing a divided psychology of Western man. There's part of us that's expansionist and looks out towards the horizon, and another part of our culture which is about this community. It looks inward at trying to make a safe environment for women and children and things like that. But perhaps that isn't actually uniquely European. The actual archaeology is more interesting, I think. It's good to have these kind of philosophical interpretations of ancient stuff. It's interesting as a thought experiment, but it's also good to refer back to the actual archaeology, the actual sources, because I think it's quite clear that some Neolithic people were quickly adopted into, or they were quickly adopted into the Indo-European cultures as they expanded. So there wasn't a total elimination in all cases. I think most of especially in Britain, there was about a 90% replacement of the Neolithic people by the incomers. But there was also a mixture. I think some of that is from taking native women, but there are also examples where men, in Spain as well, you can see where men of mostly indigenous Neolithic ancestry are buried in an Indo-European context. And the same thing we see, I was talking about yesterday in my stream about much, much later in history with the Anglo-Saxon invasion in the 5th century. We have example of a man of 100% Iron Age British ancestry who is buried at a time when the Iron Age Britons had been Romanized and Christianized already, but he had been buried with weapons in a barrow, a pagan barrow, with Germanic people. So he had been completely adopted the pagan worldview, the pagan religion, and been welcomed into the Germanic Anglo-Saxon culture. So it's possible that people from one culture sometimes perceive that another culture is better than their own. And actually the English did a similar thing in in America, when some Native Americans would kidnap English people when they were young, and then when the English would try and rescue the person back, they'd find they didn't want to be rescued because they actually preferred to live free as an Indian did, galloping around without a saddle and hunting animals rather than paying taxes and going to church. So there's that will to freedom that exists and in humans. So I can imagine that the Neolithic people, and now we know, as I said, the Neolithic people weren't all this matriarchal communists or something like that. It's just not true. So they were warlike people, and I'm sure that some of the warlike men in the Neolithic cultures saw the warlike Indo-European culture and thought that was cool, and they wanted to be part of that.
Yeah, it might be worth this contact between the Neolithic and the Indo-European is very interesting, particularly when one thinks about Greece. So I think about it's interesting. I don't know right now. I'm kind of speculating a little, but obviously the Homeric Greeks, right? There's lots of features of Indo-European civilization, the horse carriage, so on and so forth. But presumably at this time, there would have been a lot of pre-Indo-European people around, right? From the Minoan culture and things like that. So is this, and I've seen that the Dorian invasion hypothesis is quite controversial. I don't think everyone agrees about it. Could you just speak a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, the idea of the Doric invasion is that a northerly, more warlike people came in to Greece and replace a southerly, more peaceful people. But now the problem is, we know the Indo-European, that got conflated with the arrival of Indo-European language or Proto-Greeks. But now we know that we've got like ancient DNA from Greece. The arrival of Indo-European DNA and lineages into Greece begins 2200 BC, which is long before the Doric culture. So some people don't even think a Doric invasion occurred. If it occurred, though, it was the invasion of another Indo-European culture into an already Indo-European culture, because we know for sure the Indo-European culture was in Greece starting 2200, and it's coming directly from the steppe by the catacomb culture. So the Mycenaean or Mycenaean culture is going to be directly derived from the catacomb culture. And that happened a long time before Homer was writing. So I think by the time Homer's writing, there are no Pelasgians or like pre-Indo-European people in the sense of language. However, the Minoans were, we can tell the Mycenaeans genetically were like Minoans, but with an Indo-European element added, whereas the Minoans were basically like pure Anatolian-derived Neolithic Europeans. So the Minoan culture of Crete was really one of the most advanced of all the Neolithic European cultures. And it survives in the historical record, and its writings do, though not deciphered. But I think in Greece, generally, you're going to see like everyone's speaking some form of Proto-Greek by the time of Homer, and had done for a long time. The Homeric writings depict a very clearly Indo-European culture in most respects.
Well, that's what I found confusing. I mean, this is an example of me reading outdated books, because I've been reading Will Durant's book on Greece, and the way that he was writing this, obviously, in the 50s or maybe the 60s. And the way that he talks about it is you have the Homeric Greeks, and sometime shortly after that, you have the Dorian invasion, and these people are from the north. But then, you hear about what I found confusing was, Achilles is described as a redhead, and there's all of these noticeably Indo-European features. So like what you're saying is that the Indo-Europeans had arrived long before Homer and long before the Dorians.
I think there's a problem with using phenotype to try and measure something, phenotype described in literature, ancient literature, to try and measure the ancient migrations. It's not a reliable metric. What we know, though, is that, there was a popular belief, not entirely unfounded, in olden times, that in the Victorian times, for example, that the early Europeans were darker and smaller, and the Indo-European invaders were more blonde and bigger. Now, they were, the bigger and smaller parts are correct, but the more blonde part is not, or generally not correct. It can be in some cases, because, for example, I mean, in Britain, it does seem that the Bell Beaker people, Indo-European invaders, were more likely to be fair-haired than the Neolithic people. But some Neolithic cultures in Europe already displayed blondism. For example, the globular amphora culture and the linear pottery culture both had some presence of that. And the people on the steppe, the Proto-Indo-Europeans, were not blonde, actually. So the original Proto-Indo-Europeans, most of them had brown hair. Most of the samples have brown hair. Some of them have black hair. And so then and everyone in those days had a darker complexion on average than Northern Europeans did. Whether you're talking about the Neolithic Europeans of the Western Europe or the steppe Europeans of the East, all of them were generally darker complexioned, because over the Bronze Age, and especially the Iron Age, there have been very strong selection pressures for the lightening of our complexions. And blondism, as I explained also in a stream specifically on the topic of blondism, similarly underwent selection pressure. So blondism existed both in Neolithic European cultures, some rarely, and also rarely in the Indo-European gene pool as well. They both had some blonde, the genes for blonde, and it's likely that blondism was more a trait associated with children. Like you get neotenic blondism, where the child is born blonde and then the hair gets darker. But something happened in the Bronze Age which led to the blonde phenotype becoming much more common. And that has nothing to do with one blonde population replacing a darker population. That's not what happened at all. What we're seeing is two largely dark-haired populations mixing, and then selection pressures, or whether sexual or environmental, resulting in a much more common blonde phenotype. Now, ancient Greeks may have been much more blonde than modern Greeks if the contemporary descriptions and depictions are accurate. It's possible that these are idealized depictions and that this was just the ideal that they aspired to. They considered it to be more beautiful, but actually, in general, most of them didn't have blonde hair. Or it's possible that they really did or have much more common frequency of blonde hair. But that does not mean that there must therefore have been a more common presence of the genes associated with the populations who are more likely to be blonde today. For example, Swedes. It doesn't mean that because they had, now we associate blondism with Swedes, for example. That doesn't mean if blondism was more common in Greece in those times, therefore they had genes associated with Swedes. Not at all. It could very easily be, as you know, most people know, blondism is recessive. So if you have a person with blonde hair has children with someone with dark hair, the child is more likely to have dark hair than blonde hair. So in that society where there were probably some blondes and some non-blondes, over time, it seems generally that the blonde hair will become less common, and that does not require the invasion of a less blonde population to make that happen. So it doesn't have anything to do with the Indo-Europeans, and trying to use blonde hair as a metric to measure the presence of Indo-Europeans isn't really a very good way of going about it. Although in some cases it works very well. For example, in South Asia, where the Aryans who invaded South Asia certainly were blonde, and the other populations in Asia are not blonde at all. So whenever you see the presence of blonde hair in Asia, you can reliably attribute it to the presence of the Aryans.
I think that's a good segue into what I wanted to talk about next, which was you saying that that's not a reliable measure. Presumably what is archaeogenetics, the study associated with someone like David Wright, but obviously it's a much broader field than that. And you also mentioned India, and you know better than I that a lot of Hindu nationalists deny that this invasion ever occurred. But it seems that findings from archaeogenetics are making that assertion from those Hindu nationalists increasingly untenable.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been completely untenable since 2018, in my opinion. The 2015 study that showed, it was 2015 when Hark and colleagues released a study that showed Indo-European DNA, or said steppe DNA spreading was a major source of Indo-European languages in Europe. And that was when basically 2015, we could attribute the Indo-European languages in Europe came from the steppe. And that means the spread of Indo-European languages associated with that steppe DNA signal. But it didn't talk about Asia at all, that paper. Now, any amateur geneticist then could just look at DNA around the world and see where else steppe DNA is. And everyone will notice, all these amateurs like Eurogenes, the blogger, for example, clearly saw, okay, Indians have it, and it's more common in the north of India than the south of India, and it's more common among Brahmins and Kshatriya than it is among the low castes. So this is basically the Aryan invasion happened. But it wasn't until 2018 when two studies actually came out close to each other on that region of the world, where they found skeletons on the Indus Valley periphery, where a bit higher up, because the tropical weather really makes it hard to get viable DNA from skeletons there. But if you go a bit higher up in the mountains nearby, you can start to get it. And what they showed is that prior to 3,500 years ago, 1500 BC, there was no steppe DNA in India or Pakistan, and then suddenly there is, and that, you know, that's the Aryan invasion. And I made a video about that in 2019, which I did expect a few Hindu nationalists to oppose it. I actually am a very, big proponent of Hinduism. I love Hinduism. I love India. My family lived in India for 3 generations. I'm privileged to have gone there and visited my family graves. I love Hinduism. I love Indian culture. And I support Indian nationalism against the spread of communism and Islamism. So I was very surprised when many Indian nationalists suddenly took me to be public enemy number one. And really got loads of attacks. I still get lots of Indian nationalists really hate me because they perceive that I am making all this up as a way to humiliate them. Or that I'm just a British imperialist who wants to steal their culture or something like that, which is regrettable. But won't change my behaviour at all, because I'm just saying what's true. I'm just saying what the evidence is showing.
Okay, so the invasion, the Aryan invasion of India was true. It's been verified by genetic studies, but this is part of a broader trend, right? Not just to deny that invasion, but to deny invasions altogether, right? There's this growing trend within the humanities and history in particular. So, for example, when I was at university, I was told that the barbarian invasion of Rome was not so much an invasion as it was a migration. And I'm starting to notice this more and more, where historians try to reframe invasions as migrations. Why do you think that's happening?
Well, it's been happening since the 60s, especially. There have been a complete overhaul of the humanities in Western academia after the war, but specifically in the 60s. And they try to demonize or attribute unsavory motives for academics in the 19th century, saying that the conclusions they reached about ancient peoples using archaeology, history, or whatever, were actually motivated by a desire to justify colonialism or the subjugation of oppressed peoples or marginalized peoples, as they like to say. And therefore, they should all be viewed with an increasingly critical eye. That starts with, like just being more critical to the sources in the 60s. And actually, that being more critical isn't necessarily all bad, because sometimes it forces you to find more compelling and solid evidence for the claims that were made. And actually, to be fair, the Indo-European hypothesis and some of these theories that were widely believed in the 19th century and have subsequently, in recent years, been proven to be correct, were not actually fully supported by solid evidence until recently. So I don't think it was entirely unreasonable for them to be questioned or for more evidence to be sought. But what's happened since the 60s is that it's become ridiculous, and often it's termed less in context of absence of solid evidence and more in a kind of a moral crusade against colonialism in academia as they perceive it. But I mean, I had a similar thing in my master's degree. I did a dissertation on horse sacrifice in Northwestern Europe in the early medieval times, just focusing on Viking and Anglo-Saxon. But I wanted to make it more widely about comparing it to other forms of horse sacrifice, specifically in India, where there are very, very clear parallels with Germanic forms of horse sacrifice. But my personal tutor was, very against that. I mean, he, in his own book, was dismissive of comparative mythologist Georges de Mézil, who relied on Indo-European comparative mythology decades ago. But it was not at all fashionable in 2012. And in fact, the word Indo-European used in any context other than linguistic was rather suspect. It had people raising eyebrows and sort of shifting in their seats uncomfortably. But now, since 2015, everything's changed, because having vindicated the Indo-European theory, and also not even just the Indo-European theory, but showing that there was a single population responsible for that spread, and that we can trace it and date it to when it arrives in different places, means that comparative mythology and archaeology in the context of comparative mythology, like looking at comparing religious rituals in archaeological contexts, that's suddenly vindicated and becomes much more valid. And someone else at Uppsala University did a big study a couple of years ago on horse sacrifice and compared the Germanic stuff to the Indian and other Indo-European stuff in the way that I had wanted to in 2012. And that was great, because now that stuff's on the table again. And then I did a big video on it about horse sacrifice based on this person's very comprehensive paper. And I think that's great, because now we're really making some ground in anthropology again, because so everything from the 60s onwards was very also against narratives of migration and replacement, or invasion and replacement. But even migration, like, it's not just, as you say, like they prefer to sneakily replace the word invasion with migration. I think those people who do that are actually more reasonable than others who want to completely deny the idea of mass migrations. Like in the migration era, for example, it's the Aryan invasion is extremely controversial, because they tried to say that was the result of British imperialism. It was made up for British imperialists, which is nonsense. Or the Indo-European one as well, because they try to, connect that to the Indo-European expansion, to the Aryan invasion, which happened later, and say that they're both, colonial constructs or white supremacist ideals. But even more recent ones, like the Anglo-Saxon invasion, extremely hot political topic, where a combination of two motivations have meant people were very opposed to the idea that an Anglo-Saxon invasion happened in the 5th century. One of these is that sort of anti-colonial left-wing sort of, post-war anthropological approach that we've discussed. And the other is the kind of Celtic nationalism in England, where people like Francis Pryor, who is an Englishman, but they choose to identify more with Celtic ancestry or heritage than with Germanic one, which they don't like, for whatever reasons. I won't try and attribute motivations to him that I can't. But he, Francis Pryor was given, television documentaries, like book deals, to say all this stuff about how the Anglo-Saxon culture was just basically the adoption of a language from a small elite that left no real change. But now, 2 days ago, paper came out, conclusively proves it was a large-scale either invasion or migration. I'm not so bothered about which word you use, because, as I'd say to some Indian nationalists who say, look, it wasn't Aryans did come to India, but it wasn't an invasion, it was a migration. I say, whether something's an invasion or migration is really just a word game. All invasions are migrations, and some migrations are invasions. So, like, it depends. Like, if a migration happens and it's not and the migrants aren't invited, then technically that's an invasion. And any invasion is always involves a migration. If the invaders don't leave, then they're migrating. So it doesn't really matter to me. It's that distinction. But as long as people recognize that a huge number of people did move in and change the culture at that time. So the shift from Celtic to Germanic in 5th century England, the shift from whatever early language was spoken in the Indus Valley in the Bronze Age to the Vedic Sanskrit speakers who came later. That's what's key.
I think this relates to your concept of mushroom nationalism. So perhaps you could speak about this idea of mushroom nationalism.
Yeah, I said this in relation to specifically some Native American groups, and I don't have anything against Native Americans. I'm really interested in Native American culture. I'd like to study it more. But there are some kind of ideas that when they proved through genetics, and I mean, it was already quite clear from comparative mythology that the Siberians and the Native Americans are closely related, and that the Native Americans derive from a population who migrated over through Alaska into the Americas. And then with Siberians, hence why they have the same shamanic practices even now, 20,000 years or more later. But the genetics prove it. Like, not all Native Americans like that, because they kind of got the idea of themselves sort of popping, being of the soil, which is not an unnatural thing. I think it's quite natural. The word human itself derives from soil. You see in both Semitic and Indo-European cultures, there's a connection of a people to soil, as in that they themselves are derived from it. The idea that they could be made out of clay. Not all Indo-European cultures have that. Some have the idea that we're made out of wood, for example, but there's still this connection to the soil. So there's a natural feeling and a desire in mankind to belong to the land that you live on, and to be connected to it. But the idea that this kind of nationalism that denies ancient migrations, I called it mushroom nationalism, because they try to legitimize their claim to their land on the basis that they apparently popped out of the ground like mushrooms. And this includes not only so-called marginalized and post-colonial identities like Native Americans, but also white nationalist groups, some of whom think, like the BNP in 2011 in Britain. Nick Griffin went on television and tried to argue that the British genome had remained largely unchanged since the Ice Age, which is completely false. It's just not true. And I don't believe that you can have a true nationalist identity based on such a falsehood. I mean, it's one thing if it's a falsehood rooted in a native indigenous mythos, a religious mythos, but it's quite another if it's just based on fake science. I mean, that's not going to stand up. It's going to be too shaky. You can't build your house on such shaky ground. So my opinion is that there are nationalistic identities around the world also that are based on invader-conqueror narratives. You can have the Turks as an example. The Turks of Anatolia are actually very vastly majority indigenous ancestry. Most of their ancestry comes from Anatolian natives, but they attach their nationalistic identity to the Turkic speakers who brought their Turkish language. And that constitutes no more than 10% of their ancestry, actually. But that's what they prefer to identify with a migrant population of conquerors. And actually England as well, we used to be similar. We used to identify with a migrant population of conquerors, which genetic science shows actually only constitutes about 40% of our ancestry. But that is a sizable percentage, but we identify with it because that is the source of our culture. That is the source of our language. That's not mushroom nationalism. That's something rooted in a reasonable and historically accurate account of events.
When I when you were the first person who acquainted me with this term mushroom nationalism, and when I heard it, I thought about an article written by Keith Windschuttle. It's called The Extinction of the Australian Pygmies. And anyway, just to summarize it, the idea is that the actual Aboriginals of Australia that we now know were seafaring people who actually crossed and largely killed a pygmy population, which can still be found in parts of the country, in the northern parts of the country. Now, when I read this article, I was reminded of a book that I read back in the day by Manning Clark, who's sort of like the chief Australian historian, and he actually mentioned this theory. But now it's out of favor. I'm not sure if that's because it's just totally inaccurate, or if it's because of this sort of mushroom nationalism where Australian Aboriginals are denying their own conquering of the continent.
Well, I think could be a bit of both, actually, because certainly the political motivation to not humiliate, to deny the Aboriginal Australians their claim of indigeneity would be a controversial thing to do. But I actually do think that they have a very, very good claim. Genetically, they seem to have been there for a really long time, actually. And their mythology can also, the genetics proves that, but also their mythology proves that they are aware of islands that submerged like over 20,000 years ago off the coast of Australia. So they have they've been there a really long time. That doesn't mean that there weren't other races there. They could have lived alongside other races for a long time before they succeeded in eliminating them. Yeah, I do think Aboriginal Australians are definitely indigenous by any possible definition of that word you choose to use. But there are examples of other things. For example, the Native Americans, it shows it's not there. There were multiple migrations over from Siberia, and the second lot replaced a lot of the first. And actually now, really weird and quite controversial, there is a genetic signal in the Americas, specifically in the Amazon and parts of South America, of Aboriginal Australian-like DNA, which is almost entirely absent now. So it is concluded that before the Siberian Americans got there, there must have been somehow a population of people related to Australian Aboriginals who had populated parts of South America, at least, if not North America, but were wiped out almost entirely by the incoming Siberian Americans.
Extremely interesting. Okay, so maybe segueing to something a little bit different. I wanted to ask you, I was in the sauna recently and some guy started talking to me about Vikings in the Pacific. Now, anyway, I'm not going to ask if you think that's true or not. What I'm going to ask you instead is, what is the strangest historical theory that you have that's maybe starting to be borne out by genetic research or something of that nature? Do you have any really left of field theories about a migration or an event or anything like that?
I personally don't tend to get into that. I get a lot of my fans actually are, and a lot of people really love that kind of thing. And I understand why. There's something mystical like finding the Atlantids or the Lemurians or something like that, or saying like, oh, the Gaels of Ireland actually descend from a Scythian migration and from the steppes, or this kind of thing. I don't believe in those things because I just don't see the evidence for it. And the actual history of the world is perfectly strange enough as it is for me, that I don't need anything to be more mystical. I mean, to me, everything, the presence of the gods is in every historical event. Everything is imbued with the mystical element of the gods anyway. So I don't need these, to be honest, to be quite frank, fake historical events to make them more interesting for me. I mean, that thing I mentioned just now about the Aboriginal signal in the Amazon jungle is completely crazy. I can't believe it, because there's no way they could have crossed from Australia on the Pacific. So it could possibly mean that Aboriginals were, so people related to Aboriginal, it doesn't actually mean Aboriginal Australians, but, Australoid, as they used to say in the old-fashioned anthropological term, including Papua New Guineans and Negritos of the Philippines. Well, that race used to be more widespread in Southeast Asia, and perhaps also it wasn't just limited to Southeast Asia, but it spread up along the Pacific, coast and into the Americas, presumably, and then down into South America, where it survived only in one skeleton they found and did a DNA test on, and also in some remote Amazon tribes who have a trace amount of that DNA. So who knows how that happened? I tell you another thing I really like. On my honeymoon, I went to Indonesia and I went to see the Komodo dragons. And because I always wanted to see them. As I said, I was a huge fan of zoology and I love reptiles and things. So I went there, but while I was there, I stayed on Flores, the island of Flores, which is also where they discovered recently a hominid, a small hominid called, they call it Homo florensis, but it's colloquially known as the Flores hobbit. And okay, it's an ancient skeleton, it's thought probably to be some kind of pygmy version of Homo erectus or some other primitive hominid that somehow survived on this island. And then because of the small island, it got very small. How it got there, no one knows. It was, ancient, very distant Paleolithic, long time ago. But not so long that modern humans hadn't evolved, because it seems that it was driven to extinction by modern humans. Now, the archaeology only would place this extinction event, tens of thousands of years in the distant past, when the skeleton is dated, this fossil is dated. But when you talk to the people of Flores, they had like in colonial times, the Dutch and British people who spoke to the people of Flores said that they recorded that quite recently there had been a population of small, hairy people living in the jungle on Flores until they, and that these people used to kidnap their children, the human children, because they wanted them to teach them how to make fire. And the humans got rid of all the hobbits by lighting a fire at the entrance to one of their main cave, and thereby suffocating all the hobbits within. Now, this mythology is, recorded in colonial sources well over 100 years before the discovery of the Flores hobbit fossil, and it exactly matches the proportions. The size of these creatures is exactly the size of the Flores hobbit fossil, and it seems to me far too much of a coincidence. So what that would suggest is the possibility that this archaic hominid pygmy species did survive on Flores in the jungles until maybe only a few hundred years ago. And they lived alongside humans that recently. And I think that's quite plausible because of the striking resemblance of the folklore and the archaeology and the paleontology. So what else could be true? What other archaic hominids? I mean, maybe Bigfoot or Yeti or something has some other kind of parallel in the fossil record. Who knows what we'll find out in future.
Indonesian hobbit nationalism. That's what I'm about.
They had a right to exist as well.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, I don't want to keep you too much longer because we said we'd do an hour, and I think we've done a bit over that now. But I just thought maybe we could end by talking about the link between the study of history and a people's perception of themselves. I think Orwell said, those who control the past control the future, those who control the present control the past. We've spoken a bit about how those in power, whether they be Hindu nationalists or academics in the West, have sought to edit, modify our history in a number of ways. And that's because obviously the study of history shapes a people's perception of themselves. How should we relook at our history? How's that going to help us view ourselves differently?
Well, there's the ideal for Western academia and history, which distinguishes history as it's generally been studied, is that we're supposedly supposed to look just at the facts and arrive at conclusions to decipher what occurred in the past according to those facts. But even if we accept that this is this pure, unadulterated, innocent approach to history, just a search for knowledge, it's not possible for the human mind to actually do that. We don't accumulate information randomly. The brain discards and keeps certain information according to criteria of importance, what it considers to be necessary to remember. And in a way, the Western tradition of history and archaeology is inauthentic compared to the general view of history that most cultures have had, where they just have a mythologized and idealized narrative of events, which serves to reinforce the cultural norms of the present. That's actually what all cultures generally regard the past as, and they interpret everything in that way. It's only Westerners that can find something out new from the past and then reinterpret their present according to that stuff. It's something that we do. And it can be, that's very difficult because it's disruptive. That's an extremely disruptive sort of threat to present identity, because something can pop up that completely upturn your opinion of yourselves. Like most Turks aren't very happy about the fact that they're very closely related to Greeks and Armenians, for example. They don't like that at all. But we English people can be told one day that we're related to the Irish, another day we're related to the Danes, and we just take it in our stride because we're a bit different to other people in that respect. But I do think we should remember that we are humans like everyone else, and that the mythologized narrative of history is the normal narrative of history for humans, and that the original account of the Anglo-Saxon migration was fully integrated with the religious one, such that Hengist and Horsa, the descendants of the god Woden, were the progenitors. They were the first Anglo-Saxons to set foot on the sacred island of Britain. And, you know, that mythology, that mythological telling of a migration is a normal and healthy, actual human way of perceiving the past. So it shouldn't be scoffed at just because it doesn't correspond to, you know, the rigors of Western academia.
Do you think that the discoveries of 2018 will lead to a radical reshaping of European identity? It seems like obviously you discuss these facts, but I don't think the average person would be acquainted with the revolutionary changes that have happened in the study of history.
Well, the revolution, what's revolutionary is only in academia, because I think the average person on the street just thinks that the Anglo-Saxon invasion occurred, you know, and that's what all historians in the 19th century thought. That's what all historians in the early 21st century, and even in the, you know, archaeologists in the second half of the 20th century, I think most of them accepted it happened. It's only like this sort of elite ivory tower academic sort of circle that starts to scoff at the long held beliefs about the narratives of our history. And now they've just been sort of, you know, humiliated by the geneticists. And even Reich wrote an article describing the geneticists like himself as barbarians at the gates, like comparing it to the Roman invasion, because the gates are here, the gates of the history and archaeology, which are completely reject these narratives. But the geneticists are the barbarians who are showing that's not going to stand anymore. But when I noticed in the comment sections, like when I talk about the Anglo-Saxon invasion being vindicated, most people are like, wait, who said it didn't exist? They didn't even know. They're completely oblivious to the last 60 odd years of debate about this topic, because it was only ever really academics arguing with other academics. So in some sense, that's a relief to know that the average man doesn't care that much. And anyway, you know, if I meet someone in the pub, some of them assume that they're the same as ancient Celts, and some of them assume they're the same as the Anglo-Saxons, but it doesn't seem to make as huge a difference to their identity as it does to some people. Like, I think the common man is not so deep thinking about the past. He perceives Englishness in more readily to hand phenomena, like things that he experiences and things that he's aware of in his recent history. But yeah, I mean, this change in academia will have a trickle-down effect, and I think that I'm hoping that it will revitalize anthropology on the whole, because it's been throttled, I think, by this Boasian sort of reforms, and I'd like to see Western anthropology in general return to the standards of the 19th century, and with the help of modern science, that might happen.
Fantastic. Okay, well, Tom, thank you so much. I really do appreciate you taking the time, and continue the great work that you do.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the chat.
Okay, fantastic.